The scent of turpentine and aged linseed oil was the only perfume Clara Hayes allowed herself. It clung to her clothes, her skin, her hair, a constant sharp reminder of her purpose. Her fingers, delicate yet steady, traced the fine craquelure on the canvas of a 17th-century Madonna, a web of fractures marring the serene face. With a brush as fine as a needle, she applied a minuscule drop of adhesive, coaxing the flaking paint back into place. Each repaired crack was a small victory against decay, a temporary illusion of wholeness in a world that had taught her everything beautiful eventually shatters. She wasn't just restoring a painting, she was mending a ghost, trying to fix in art what she could not fix in life. The silence of her small queen's apartment was broken only by the soft scrape of her tools, a lonely sound in the encroaching twilight. If you want to discover the secret behind the brokenness she carries, watch until the end. I invite you to subscribe to the channel and comment on where you're watching from. We continue. At 24, Clara Hayes moved through the world as if apologizing for the space she occupied. Her life was a study in austerity, from her simple, dark clothing to the Spartan neatness of her apartment, a place where dreams were not allowed to gather dust because they were never unpacked. Her work as an art restorer was more than a profession. It was a calling born from ruin. She possessed a preternatural ability to see the original intent beneath layers of damage and time, a skill she had honed while watching her own family's legacy crumble into dust. Her hands, which could resurrect the vibrant hues in a faded masterpiece, remained inert in her own life, held captive by a duty that felt more like a sentence, postponing a future she was no longer sure she deserved. The emptiness inside her was a quiet, constant companion, a hollow space carved out 5 years ago. It was in this hollow space that she guarded her virginity, not as a treasure, but as a final unbroken seal on a part of herself the world had not yet managed to touch. It wasn't a moral choice or a romantic ideal, but a suit of armor forged in trauma. Intimacy to Clara was a form of surrender, a vulnerability she could not afford. It meant letting someone see the hairline fractures that spiderwebbed across her soul, the irreparable damage hidden beneath a carefully composed surface. To be touched was to risk being broken further, and she was already holding too many fragile pieces together with nothing more than sheer will and the bitter taste of resentment. The ghost that haunted her had a name, Julian Croft, but the wound he'd inflicted was her father. She remembered him before the fall, a man whose laughter filled every room of his art gallery, whose eyes shone with a passion for beauty. After the hostile takeover, a brutal and calculated corporate assassination, that man vanished. He was replaced by a hollowed-out shell who sat in the dark. The vibrant canvases he once cherished turned against the wall as if their color was too much to bear. The depression had descended upon him like a shroud, suffocating the life from their home and leaving behind a silence so profound it felt like a constant scream. Clara's mission was born in that silence, a silent vow to reclaim the light that Julian Croft had extinguished. Julian Croft. The name was a poison she swallowed daily, a source of both her pain and her power. To the world, he was a titan of finance, a ruthless magnate whose name was whispered with a mixture of fear and reverence on Wall Street. To Clara, he was a faceless architect of despair, a predator who had devoured her family's future for sport. She had spent years studying him from a distance, piecing together an image of the monster from newspaper clippings and financial reports. He was an enigma of power and cold calculation, a man who lived in a gilded cage overlooking Central Park, surrounded by priceless art. It was this collection, his only known vulnerability, his one passion that would become her point of entry into his impenetrable world. Her plan had been cultivated with the slow, meticulous patience of a master forger. Every book she read, every restoration technique she perfected, every long hour she spent toiling in obscurity was a step closer to him. Her life had been stripped of all extraneous desires, her focus narrowed to a single, burning point: infiltrate Julian Croft's inner circle. She would use her gift, her ability to heal the broken things he collected, as a Trojan horse. She would become indispensable, a quiet, efficient presence in his life, and from that vantage point, she would search for the one thing she believed had to exist, the evidence that would expose his corruption and restore her father's name. Justice was the masterpiece she was determined to create, even if she had to paint it with the ashes of her own youth. As night finally claimed the city, casting long shadows across her small workspace, Clara put down her tools. She caught her reflection in the dark glass of the window, a pale, serious face with eyes that held the weariness of someone much older. The city lights glittered like a galaxy of unattainable promises beyond the glass. Her world was here, in this room, a self-imposed exile defined by the scent of turpentine and the weight of a 5-year-old promise. She was a ghost in her own life, haunting the periphery of a world she had once belonged to, sacrificing her present for a past she could never truly reclaim. And as she turned off the single lamp, plunging the room into darkness, she knew that to face the monster, she would have to step into his world of blinding light. The journey from her quiet corner of Queens into the heart of Manhattan was a daily pilgrimage from one form of confinement to another. The subway car, packed with the anonymous, weary bodies of the city, was a steel cocoon hurtling through darkness. Clara would press her forehead against the cool, vibrating glass, watching the tunnel walls flash by in a blur of grime and graffiti. She felt like a ghost among the living, her presence as thin and insubstantial as the morning mist over the East River. Each stop brought a new wave of humanity, a tide of coughs, conversations, and the faint scent of ambition and despair. For them, the city was a ladder to climb. For her, it was a battleground, and she was moving toward the enemy's fortress, armed with nothing but a quiet resolve and the ghosts of a life that was no longer hers. Her first stop was not a studio or a museum, but a small, overfurnished house in Astoria, where the air was thick with the scent of potpourri and regret. This was her parents' home, a shrine to a past that was both idealized and mourned. Faded photographs lined the walls, capturing a family that no longer existed, one with bright smiles, untroubled eyes, and a future that seemed as solid as the oak furniture. Now, silence in these rooms had a physical weight, pressing down on everything. Dust motes danced in the slivers of sunlight that pierced the heavy floral curtains, illuminating a world frozen in time. Coming here was like stepping into a perfectly preserved ruin, and every visit was a reminder of the debt she was trying to pay, a debt measured not in dollars, but in a father's lost light. Her mother, Eleanor, moved through this space with a brittle, determined energy, her love a form of relentless management. She would straighten a cushion Clara had just sat on, her hands constantly busy, as if stillness would cause the entire fragile structure of their lives to collapse. Her conversations were a tapestry of passive anxieties and pointed suggestions. She spoke of the neighbors' daughters getting married, of the security of a good husband, of a life less precarious than the one Clara had chosen. Each word was a carefully placed stone in the wall of expectation being built around Clara, a life of quiet domesticity and predictable comfort. Her mother couldn't understand the fire in her daughter's veins, mistaking her quiet intensity for sadness and her focused mission for a stubborn refusal to move on from the past. The centerpiece of this living mausoleum was her father, Arthur. He spent his days in a worn armchair, facing a window that overlooked a small, neglected garden. He rarely spoke. The vibrant, passionate art dealer who had taught Clara to see the soul in a brushstroke was gone, replaced by this hollowed-out man whose eyes held a permanent, vacant sorrow. He was a living testament to Julian Croft's cruelty, a masterpiece of a man systematically destroyed and left to fade in a darkened room. Clara would bring him a cup of tea, her hand hovering over his shoulder, wanting to offer a comfort that words could not provide. His stillness was a constant, silent accusation, a reminder that her fight was not just for his honor, but for the very essence of the man he once was. The financial pressure was a slow, constant suffocation. Her modest salary from the restoration jobs she took on was stretched thin, covering her own rent, groceries, and the lion's share of her parents' mortgage and the mounting medical bills. The letters from banks and insurance companies were hidden in a drawer in her mother's desk, but Clara felt their presence like a physical weight in the house. This wasn't just a moral obligation, it was a chain. Every dollar she earned was another link binding her to this life of servitude, postponing any possibility of a future that belonged to her alone. Her dream of studying in Florence, of walking the same streets as the masters she so revered, had long ago been packed away like a childhood relic, a casualty of a war she was still fighting. Her older sister Amelia had escaped. She had married a sensible accountant and moved to a manicured suburb on Long Island, her life a portrait of the stability their mother so desperately craved for Clara. During her infrequent visits, Amelia would look at Clara with a mixture of pity and veiled judgment. She didn't understand Clara's fierce loyalty to a past she felt they should all be trying to forget. "You're wasting your best years, living for a ghost," she'd said once. Her words meant to be kind but landing like shards of glass. Amelia's pragmatism felt like a betrayal, creating a chasm between them. While her sister built a new life on a foundation of willful amnesia, Clara remained behind, the sole custodian of their family's broken history, determined to rebuild it piece by piece. One Sunday, her mother orchestrated an ambush, a casual lunch with a nice young man from their church, an earnest architect with kind eyes and a predictable future. Clara sat through the meal, a polite smile fixed on her face, feeling utterly alien. He spoke of building plans and retirement funds, of a life laid out like a blueprint, safe and orderly. She listened, but her mind was miles away, in a cold penthouse overlooking Central Park, dissecting the weaknesses of a man who built empires on ruin. The architect's touch, a gentle brush of his hand against hers, felt like an intrusion, a foreign energy against which her entire being recoiled. The encounter only solidified her resolve. The safe harbor they offered her felt more like a cage than the dangerous sea she was determined to sail. Returning to the solitude of her own apartment was like taking a first breath after being held underwater. Here, amidst the familiar sharp scent of her work, she was in control. The oppressive weight of family expectation and financial burden lifted, replaced by the singular focus of her mission. She would work late into the night, the delicate task of mending a crack in a 400-year-old canvas, requiring a surgeon's precision and a scholar's patience. This was her training ground. Every repaired fracture, every restored color, was a rehearsal for the far greater restoration she planned to undertake. In this small, quiet room, she was not a dutiful daughter or a pitied sister. She was a strategist, a warrior sharpening her one and only weapon in the encroaching darkness. The file on Julian Croft was her Bible and her curse. It sat on her desk, a thick manila folder filled with years of research, newspaper clippings detailing his ruthless acquisitions, financial reports printed in microscopic font, and grainy photographs of him entering black cars, his face always a mask of cold indifference. The pressure from her family, the sight of her father's empty eyes, the quiet judgment of her sister, it all funneled into this single point of obsession. Her plan was no longer just about justice. It had become a desperate bid for freedom. To dismantle Julian Croft's empire was to dismantle the prison that had been built around her own life. He was the architect of her family's ruin, and in his downfall, she saw the only possible blueprint for her own survival. That evening, she sat before her laptop, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. The final piece of her portfolio was in place, a series of stunning before and after photographs of her most challenging restoration, a damaged Renaissance portrait. She had discovered through a discreet contact that Croft's private curator was looking for a specialist with exactly this skill set. This was her opening. Taking a deep, unsteady breath, she composed the email, attaching the file that represented her entire life's work and her one shot at infiltration. As she clicked send, the sound echoed in the silent apartment like a gunshot. There was no turning back now. She had just knocked on the monster's door, praying he would be foolish enough to let her in. The call came on a Tuesday, a day of muted grey skies that mirrored the color of Clara's own muted existence. The voice on the other end was clipped, professional, and belonged to the curator of the Croft collection. It was an invitation, couched in the language of a summons, to a preliminary consultation at Mr. Croft's private residence. The address given was for a sliver of glass and steel that pierced the sky over Central Park, a modern-day Olympus. As Clara hung up the phone, her hand was trembling, but not from fear. It was the tremor of a hunter who has just caught the scent of her prey. The years of preparation, of quiet, obsessive work, had funneled down to this single moment. She was no longer just a restorer of old paintings. She was about to step into the frame of a very dangerous picture, one she had been sketching in her mind for 5 long years. The building's lobby was a monument to cold, sterile power. It was a vast, echoing space of white marble and dark, polished wood, where the only art on display was the art of intimidation. The air itself seemed filtered of all human warmth, smelling faintly of money and ozone. Clara felt her simple wool coat and worn leather boots were a glaring transgression in this temple of wealth. The doorman, a figure of imposing stillness, regarded her with a glance that was both dismissive and deeply assessing. As she gave her name, she felt like an imposter, a ghost from a lower world trespassing in the realm of the gods. This was Julian Croft's world, a place designed to make people feel small and insignificant, and she understood with a chilling clarity that this environment was a direct extension of the man himself, a fortress built of glass and indifference. The elevator ascended in unnerving silence, a chrome and steel capsule rocketing her away from the familiar gravity of her own life. There were no buttons to press. A discreet security guard had swiped a keycard, sending her directly to the penthouse. The city fell away beneath her, the familiar grid of streets and avenues transforming into an abstract pattern of distant lights. With each floor she climbed, the pressure in her ears was a physical manifestation of the psychological pressure building inside her. She was rising into the heart of the enemy's territory, a place she had only ever seen in the glossy pages of architectural magazines. The smooth, silent ascent felt final, a crossing of a threshold from which she knew there could be no simple return. She was leaving Clara Hayes, the quiet restorer, behind on the ground floor. The elevator doors opened directly into the apartment, and the first thing that struck her was the light. It poured in through floor-to-ceiling windows that wrapped around the entire space, framing a breathtaking, godlike view of Central Park. The apartment was less a home and more a private museum, curated with a ruthless precision. Masterpieces hung on stark white walls, spotlit with the reverence of a gallery. The furniture was minimalist, sculptural, and seemed chosen to not distract from the art. There was no clutter, no personal photographs, no sign of a life lived messily within these perfect walls. It was a space of profound, beautiful isolation. A slender woman with an austere haircut, the curator, greeted her with a nod, her voice as cool and measured as the environment itself, leading Clara toward a vast, open-plan library where a single damaged canvas stood on an easel. He appeared without a sound, a shadow detaching itself from a darker corner of the room. Julian Croft was not what she had expected. The photographs had shown a man, but the reality was a presence, an energy that seemed to subtly alter the density of the air around him. He was taller than she'd imagined, dressed in a bespoke charcoal suit that fit his lean frame with surgical precision. His face was a study in sharp angles and controlled composure, his dark eyes holding a chilling stillness. As he moved into the light, she saw the faint lines of exhaustion or strain around those eyes, the only imperfection in an otherwise flawless mask. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. This was him, the architect of her family's ruin. The faceless monster from her nightmares was standing 10 feet away, and he was devastatingly real. "You're the restorer," he said. It wasn't a question. His voice was a low baritone, devoid of any warmth, a tool for conveying information, not emotion. He didn't offer his hand or a greeting. His gaze swept over her, a quick, dismissive inventory that took in her simple clothes and earnest face, and she felt a hot flush of shame and anger. He had already categorized her, filed her away as another cog in the vast machinery of his life. She forced herself to meet his eyes, holding his gaze for a fraction of a second longer than was comfortable. "Clara Hayes," she replied, her own voice steadier than she felt, a small act of defiance in the face of his overwhelming power. "It's an honor to be consulted on your collection, Mr. Croft." The lie tasted like ash in her mouth. His gaze dropped from her face to her hands. For a long moment, he simply stared at them, and Clara felt an involuntary urge to hide them behind her back. They were capable hands, but not delicate. There were faint stains of pigment under her nails, a small callus on her index finger from the constant, careful grip of a brush. They were the hands of a worker, a craftsman. He seemed to see all of this in his silent, analytical appraisal. It was the first time his expression shifted from detached indifference to something more focused, a flicker of clinical interest. He was not looking at her as a woman or even as a person, but as a specialized instrument. he was considering acquiring for a specific task. To him, she was her function, nothing more. The work is a minor piece by a student of Caravaggio, he stated, turning his attention to the painting on the easel. Most experts have attributed the damage to poor storage during the Second World War. They're wrong. He gestured toward a darkened corner of the canvas. The craquelure pattern is inconsistent. The damage is more recent and... It wasn't accidental. It was a deliberate, if clumsy, attempt at a forgery to cover the original signature. His analysis was sharp, precise, and utterly correct. It was a detail she had noticed in the high-resolution photographs, but hadn't expected him to see. The observation revealed a depth of knowledge that went far beyond mere ownership. He didn't just collect art, he understood it, dissected it, with the same ruthless intelligence he applied to the financial markets. Clara stepped closer to the canvas, her professional instincts momentarily overriding her personal mission. The familiar scent of aged varnish and decaying canvas was a grounding force in this alien environment. The forger used a synthetic resin to mimic aged patina, she said, her voice gaining confidence as she spoke the language she knew best. But they applied it too thickly. It shrank as it dried, pulling at the original paint layer beneath it. The damage isn't from the war, it's from a lie told 50 years ago. She looked up and found him watching her, his head tilted slightly. For an instant, the vast space of the penthouse seemed to shrink, collapsing to the charged space between the two of them and the damaged painting. The power dynamic had shifted. They were no longer just a billionaire and a potential employee. They were two minds engaged in a silent, intellectual dance. He gave a single, sharp nod, an almost imperceptible sign of approval. The moment of connection, if it could be called that, was severed as quickly as it had formed. The curator has your contract and the details of the project. You will have full access to the library and the necessary equipment. You will work here, at night. I do not wish to be disturbed during the day. He turned and walked away without another word, disappearing back into the shadows from which he had emerged. The coldness descended again, more jarring than before because of the brief spark of intellectual heat that had preceded it. Clara was left, standing in the immense silent room, her heart still beating a frantic rhythm. She had come to find a monster, but she had found something far more dangerous, a man she was beginning to find utterly fascinating. The first week was a study in silence. Clara worked under the focused glow of a single restoration lamp, the vast dark library her solitary kingdom. But she was not alone. Julian Croft was a ghost in his own home, a peripheral presence she felt more than saw. He would appear at the edge of the light, a glass of whiskey in hand, and watch her work. He never spoke, but his stillness was a form of interrogation. His gaze felt like a physical weight on her shoulders, on the back of her neck, on her hands, as they performed their delicate surgery on the canvas. She could feel him dissecting her every movement, her every choice of pigment and solvent, and she worked with a fierce, defiant concentration, refusing to let him see the tremor in her hands. She was the invader, yet he made her feel like the one being trespassed upon. Her mind and skill laid bare for his silent, clinical evaluation. Her nights bled into a strange, disorienting rhythm, defined by the scent of old paper and his expensive, subtle cologne. The penthouse became a world unto itself, a gilded cage suspended above the sleeping city. One evening, while meticulously cleaning the surface of a Dutch still life, he finally broke the silence. "You treat it with a reverence it doesn't deserve," he said, his voice startlingly close behind her. "It's a memento mori, a reminder of decay, not a celebration of beauty." Clara didn't turn around, her focus remaining on the tiny swatch of canvas. "They aren't mutually exclusive," she countered, her voice low but steady. "Sometimes the most beautiful things are the ones that acknowledge the inevitability of their own ruin. It makes their brief moment of perfection more poignant." A long silence followed, and in it she felt the first shift, a subtle recalibration of the power between them. The intellectual sparring became their new language. They argued over the symbolism in a Goya etching, the provenance of a Tang dynasty sculpture, the precise chemical composition of Veronese green. These were not idle debates, they were skirmishes, each of them testing the other's defenses. He would use his ruthless logic, his knowledge honed by acquisition and power, to try and dismantle her arguments. But Clara fought back with a quiet, unshakable passion. her knowledge born not of ownership, but of an intimate hands-on communion with the art itself. She saw the artist's hesitation in a brushstroke. He saw the market value in a signature. During one heated discussion, he stopped mid-sentence, a look of genuine surprise crossing his features. "You actually feel this, don't you?" he asked, the words less an accusation and more a discovery of some rare, alien species. Slowly, the fortress of her hatred began to show cracks. She had come, here to study a monster, but she was discovering a man of infuriating complexity. She saw him one night staring out at the city skyline, the hard lines of his face softened by the distant lights, and for a fleeting moment he looked profoundly lonely. He would forget she was there, lost in thought, and a shadow of something that looked like pain would cross his face. These were the moments that unsettled her the most. They were glimpses behind the curtain, unintentional revelations of a wound. He kept carefully hidden. It was becoming harder to reconcile the cold-blooded predator from her father's stories with the man who could speak with such quiet, aching tenderness about the way a sculptor had captured the fall of light on marble. The physical space between them began to shrink. One evening she needed to examine a large, heavy folio on a high shelf she couldn't reach. Before she could find a step stool, he was there, his body close behind hers as he reached for the book. For a few seconds she was enveloped in his presence, the warmth radiating from his chest, the clean scent of his shirt, the faint sound of his breathing. His arm brushed against her shoulder, and a jolt of pure, unadulterated electricity shot through her, startling in its intensity. He handed her the book, their fingers touching for a fraction of a second. The contact was brief, accidental, yet it burned on her skin for hours, a brand of forbidden awareness. She retreated to her work table, her heart hammering, utterly shaken by the raw, physical pull she felt toward the man she was supposed to destroy. After that, she became hyper-aware of him in a way that was both agonizing and thrilling. She learned the sound of his footsteps on the polished hardwood floors, the soft click of the decanter when he poured himself a drink, the particular way he would sigh when he thought he was alone. Her senses, usually reserved for the nuances of art, were now entirely focused on him. It was a betrayal of her mission, a betrayal of her father, a betrayal of the cold, hard shell she had built around her own heart. The desire that was awakening inside her was terrifying. It was a wild, unknown thing, something she had successfully suppressed for her entire life. To want, and to want him of all people, felt like a profound moral failing, a weakness she despised in herself, even as she found herself powerless against it. He, too, seemed to be fighting a battle. After the incident with the book, he became colder, more distant, retreating behind a wall of curt professional remarks. He would find fault with her work where there was none, his criticism sharp and unwarranted. It was a clumsy attempt to push her away, to re-establish the sterile boundary of employer and employee, but the effort was transparent. It was the desperate act of a man who felt himself losing control, and his struggle only made him more compelling. Clara saw his resistance for what it was: fear. The man who controlled empires, who could make or break fortunes with a single phone call, was afraid of the quiet, unassuming restorer in his library. The realization was a dangerous and intoxicating form of power she had never known. She began to search for the evidence she had come for with a renewed, almost frantic urgency. She needed to find the proof of his villainy, the cold, hard facts that would reaffirm her hatred and extinguish this treacherous spark of connection. She needed to remember why she was here. While he was out at late-night meetings, she would meticulously go through the files and records in his library, her hands shaking as she opened each drawer, half hoping and half dreading what she might find. But the search yielded nothing but legitimate business dealings and investment records. The monster remained elusive, hidden behind layers of perfectly legal, ruthlessly efficient capitalism. The lack of a smoking gun left her untethered, adrift in a sea of moral ambiguity, with nothing to hold on to but her own confusing, burgeoning feelings. One night, she found him not in the library, but in a smaller, more personal study she hadn't seen before. He was standing before a small, simple portrait of a woman with sad, gentle eyes. It was painted with a tenderness that was completely at odds with the other masterpieces in his collection. He didn't hear Clara enter. "She was my mother," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. She believed that beauty was the only thing that could save the world. She was wrong. He turned to face Clara, and in his eyes she saw a flicker of the same profound, bottomless grief she saw in her own father's. In that moment, he wasn't Julian Croft, the corporate titan. He was just a son who had lost his mother, a man whose cynicism had been forged in a fire she couldn't possibly imagine. That shared glimpse of grief was a turning point. It irrevocably altered the landscape between them. The hatred she had nurtured for 5 years felt thin and brittle, a childish thing in the face of such complex adult sorrow. She began to see her mission not as a noble quest for justice, but as a blunt, cruel instrument. How could she destroy this man, who was so much more than the caricature she had created in her mind? The thought of her father's vacant eyes warred with the image of Julian's face, stripped bare of its defenses. She was trapped between two loyalties, two pains, the one she had inherited and the one she was beginning to feel as her own. The dilemma was no longer a matter of strategy, it was a matter of the soul. The tension in the library became a living entity, a third presence in the room. The air was thick with unspoken words, with desires acknowledged but resisted. A simple glance across the room could feel as intimate as a touch. He started finding reasons to be there, staying later and later, sometimes just sitting in a leather armchair in the shadows, reading while she worked. He claimed the silence, helped him think, but they both knew it was a lie. He was there for her, and she, in turn, found herself working more slowly, drawing out her tasks, manufacturing reasons to stay. The penthouse, once the enemy's fortress, had become a strange and dangerous sanctuary, the only place in the world where she felt completely, terrifyingly alive. Her virginity, once her armor, now felt like a fragile glass wall. It was the last piece of her old self, the self that was defined by duty and trauma. On the other side of that wall was a world of sensation and feeling she had only ever read about, a world Julian's mere presence seemed to promise. She would catch her reflection in the dark windows of the penthouse and see a stranger looking back at her, a woman with flushed cheeks and wide, hungry eyes. The desire she felt was a desire for him, but it was also a desire to be seen, to be touched, to finally feel something other than the crushing weight of responsibility. To surrender to him would be to surrender the girl she had been, the girl who had made a solemn vow at her father's side. Julian seemed to sense this shift in her, this internal battle reaching its breaking point. His own control was visibly fraying at the edges. One night, as she was packing up her tools, he cornered her between the work table and a towering bookshelf. He didn't touch her, but his proximity was overwhelming, his body heat a palpable force. "What do you want, Clara?" he asked, his voice a low, rough whisper. The question hung in the air, stripped of all pretense. He wasn't asking about the restoration project. He was asking about the war raging in her eyes, the one that mirrored his own. She couldn't speak, her throat tight with a mixture of fear and a longing so intense it was a physical pain. She wanted to run, but her feet were rooted to the floor. He raised a hand, his fingers hesitating for a moment before gently touching her cheek. His touch was not cold or calculating. It was tentative, almost reverent, as if he were touching something impossibly fragile. His thumb stroked her jawline, sending a tremor through her entire body. "You don't belong here," he murmured, his eyes searching hers, filled with a raw, unguarded emotion she had never seen in him before. "You should run from me, as fast as you can." It was a warning, but it sounded like a plea. He was giving her an escape, a final chance to save herself from him and from the part of herself that wanted to be consumed by him. The choice was hers, and it was the most terrifying choice she had ever faced. He leaned in, his lips just inches from hers. She could feel his breath on her skin, smell the faint scent of whiskey, and something that was uniquely him. This was it, the moment of transgression, the point of no return. Her entire life, her mission, her promise to her father, it all dissolved in the intense, magnetic pull between them. Every rational thought screamed at her to pull away, to slap his hand away, to run, but her body betrayed her. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering closed, a silent, complete surrender. She was no longer a daughter seeking revenge. She was just a woman, on the precipice of a desire so profound it threatened to shatter her entire world. But the kiss never came. With a shuddering breath that sounded like a curse, he pulled his hand back as if he'd been burned. He took a step back, the mask of cold indifference slamming back into place, though his eyes still held the storm of his inner conflict. "Get out," he said, his voice harsh, guttural. The words were a dismissal, but also an act of self-preservation. He turned his back on her, staring out at the indifferent city lights, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Clara stood frozen for a moment, the ghost of his touch still tingling on her skin. Then, grabbing her bag, she fled. She ran from the library, from the penthouse, from him. But she knew, with a devastating certainty, that she could not run from herself. Alone in the cold, rattling subway car on the long journey back to Queens, Clara felt the full weight of her dilemma crash down upon her. The clear, sharp lines of her world had dissolved into a blurry, emotional chaos. Her hatred for Julian Croft, the single, solid pillar that had supported her for 5 years, had crumbled into dust. In its place was something far more complicated and dangerous. A deep, undeniable connection to a man who was both her target and her temptation. She had come to his world to find a monster and expose his secrets, but in the process she was discovering her own. The choice was no longer about justice for her father, it was about the survival of her own soul. Ceding to this desire would not just be an act of betrayal, but an act of self-annihilation. The flight from the penthouse was a blur of motion and a storm of sensation, the ghost of his touch on her cheek, the harsh finality of his voice, the scent of his library, it all clung to her as she descended back into the real world. But the real world no longer felt real. Her small apartment, usually a sanctuary of focused solitude, now felt like a prison cell, its 4 walls pressing in on her with the full weight of her lonely, self-imposed duty. She looked at her hands, the hands that were supposed to be instruments of justice, and saw only the hands of a coward who had run away. The mission, her father, the past 5 years of sacrifice, it all felt like a story about someone else. A reckless, terrifying clarity cut through her confusion. Running from him had been a mistake. Running from this feeling was an act of slow suicide. She had to go back. The second journey to his building that night was a fever dream. She moved through the sleeping city not as a strategist or an avenger, but as a moth drawn to a devastatingly bright flame. The doorman's eyes widened in surprise, but he said nothing as she swept past him toward the elevator, her entire being humming with a single desperate purpose. As she ascended in the silent chrome capsule, she wasn't rising to an enemy's fortress. She was returning to the only place on Earth where she had ever felt truly seen. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by a much larger, more powerful force, the terrifying certainty that her life would be a barren wasteland if she did not see this through to its conclusion, whatever that might be. She was done fighting it. She was done running. He was standing exactly where she had left him, a dark silhouette against the glittering tapestry of the city, his back to the room. The only sound was the faint clink of ice in the glass he held. He didn't turn at the sound of the elevator doors, as if he had been expecting her or perhaps wishing for her all along. "I told you to leave, Clara," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl that vibrated through the floorboards. The words were a warning, a final attempt to erect the wall between them. But they lacked the conviction of his earlier dismissal. They were the words of a man trying to convince himself, not her. She walked slowly into the room, her footsteps echoing in the vast, cathedral-like silence, stopping just a few feet behind him, her heart a wild drum against her ribs. She didn't offer an excuse or an apology. The time for games, for pretense, was over. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was barely a whisper, yet it carried the weight of her entire being. "You told me to run," she said, the words a raw, honest confession. "I can't." At that, he finally turned, his face a mask of torment. The sight of her, her eyes wide and luminous with a mixture of defiance and surrender, seemed to shatter the last of his formidable control. He looked at her as if she were both his salvation and his ruin, and in his gaze she saw the reflection of her own internal chaos. The vast space of the library, filled with the priceless ghosts of history, collapsed into the few feet of charged air that separated their bodies. Nothing else in the world existed. He crossed the distance between them in 2 long strides, his movements fluid and predatory. He stopped directly in front of her, so close she had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. She could see the storm in his dark eyes, the battle he was losing with himself. His hands came up, not to touch her, but to brace themselves on the bookshelf behind her, caging her in. "Do you have any idea what you are doing?" he breathed, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't name. It was a question, but it was also a plea for her to understand the danger she was inviting. She gave a single, almost imperceptible shake of her head. She didn't know, and for the first time in her life she didn't care. She only knew that this was inevitable, written in a language older than reason. His mouth descended on hers, and it was not a kiss of tenderness, but of pure, unadulterated desperation. It was a collision, a frantic, hungry claiming that spoke of years of starvation. All the unspoken arguments, the simmering tension, the forbidden desire, it all poured into that single, explosive point of contact. Clara's mind went white with the shock of it. His lips were firm, demanding, and tasted of whiskey and profound loneliness. One of his hands left the bookshelf to tangle in her hair, tilting her head back, while the other slid down her back, pressing her body flush against his. Her armor, the carefully constructed virginity she had guarded for so long, didn't just crack. It vaporized, leaving her utterly exposed, every nerve ending set ablaze by the raw, overwhelming force of his need. The initial desperation of the kiss slowly morphed into something deeper, a current of aching tenderness flowing beneath the torrent of passion. He broke away, his forehead resting against hers, both of them breathing heavily as if they had just surfaced from a great depth. His eyes, dark and intense, searched hers. Without a word, he scooped her into his arms. The sudden weightlessness was disorienting, thrilling. She wrapped her arms around his neck, burying her face in the crook of his shoulder, inhaling the clean, masculine scent of him. He carried her out of the library, past the silent, judging eyes of the portraits on the walls, moving with a grim, determined purpose. Each step he took was a step further away from the lives they had known, carrying them both over a threshold into a new, uncharted territory from which there would be no return. His bedroom was a realm of shadows and muted colors, a stark contrast to the brilliant, museum-like quality of the rest of the penthouse. The only light came from the city itself, filtering through the vast floor-to-ceiling windows. It was a deeply personal space, and the sight of an unmade bed, a book left open on the nightstand, felt like a more profound intimacy than the kiss itself. He laid her gently on the cool, high-thread count sheets, the fabric a shocking sensory contrast to the heat of her skin. He loomed over her, his expression stripped of all its usual arrogance and control. In the dim light, she saw only a raw, aching vulnerability in his eyes, a silent question that asked for more than just her body. It asked for a reprieve from his own solitude. This was not a seduction, it was a confession told in the language of touch. As he removed her simple clothes, his movements were slow, almost reverent, as if he were unwrapping a priceless artifact he was afraid of damaging. When his skin finally met hers, it was with a shudder that ran through both of them. For Clara, who had lived her life at a careful remove from her own body, the sensation was overwhelming, a complete, terrifying and beautiful dissolution of the boundaries she had so carefully maintained. He touched her with a desperate gentleness, his hands mapping the lines of her body, his lips whispering her name against her, skin like a prayer. He was not the monster, not the magnate, but a man drowning, and she was the only solid thing in his world to hold on to. In the quiet aftermath, tangled together in the sheets, the world outside seemed to fall away. The silence that settled between them was not empty, but filled with the profound weight of their transgression. He held her tightly against his side, one arm draped protectively over her waist, his breathing slowly returning to normal. He stared out at the city, lights, but his gaze was distant, turned inward. After a long moment he spoke, his voice low and rough in the darkness. "I haven't let anyone stay the night in this room since she died," he murmured, the words a raw, unguarded admission. He didn't say who she was, but Clara felt the ghost of that long-ago pain in the sudden tightening of his grip. He had not just shared his body with her, he had shared the most sacred, wounded corner of his solitary world. The dawn that broke over Manhattan was a cold, indifferent blade of light, slicing through the panoramic windows of the penthouse. It found Clara awake, wrapped in sheets that no longer held the warmth of the night, but instead smelled faintly of his cologne, and a profound, echoing loneliness. Julian was already dressed, standing by the window in a crisp white shirt and dark trousers, his back to her. The vulnerable man who had held her in the darkness was gone, replaced by the familiar, imposing silhouette of Julian Croft, the magnate. He had rebuilt his fortress around himself while she slept, and she was now on the outside of its walls. The intimacy of their shared breath had evaporated, leaving behind only the sterile, silent air of a transaction that had been completed. She felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning temperature. It was the chilling recognition of an ending. He finally turned, but his eyes did not meet hers. Instead, his gaze fell on a crystal glass on a side table, as if it were the most important object in the room. "My driver will be waiting for you downstairs in 30 minutes, he said, his voice flat and devoid of the raw emotion that had colored it just hours before. It was the voice he used for business, for dismissals, for severing ties with cold, clean efficiency. He walked over to a sleek modern desk, opened a drawer, and placed a checkbook on its polished surface. He didn't have to say another word. The gesture was a brutal, deafening scream. He was quantifying their night, reducing the shattering of her world and the cracking of his own to a figure with a series of zeros. It was a calculated act of cruelty, designed to erase the connection, to re-establish the chasm between their worlds, and put her firmly back in her place. The journey back to Queens was an exercise in numb disbelief. Clara sat huddled in the back of the silent, opulent town car, the city flashing past her window in a meaningless blur of steel and glass. She felt a profound and hollow ache, deep in her bones, a feeling of being utterly scoured out. The woman who had fled the penthouse the night before, torn by conflict, was a different person from the one returning now. That woman had been a girl playing at a dangerous game. This woman was irrevocably altered, branded by an experience that had simultaneously awakened and destroyed her. She had given away the one part of herself she had kept sacred, not in a moment of love, but in a storm of desperate, shared loneliness. And now, in the cold light of day, she was left with nothing but the bitter taste of her own transgression and the crushing weight of his rejection. Back in his sky-high sanctuary, Julian stood in the center of his bedroom, the faint, lingering scent of her skin on his pillows, a form of exquisite torture. He had systematically broken every rule he had built to survive in the wake of his mother's death. Rules about distance, about control, about never, ever letting anyone see the wounded thing that lived inside him. Clara had not just slipped past his defenses, she had detonated them. In her surrender, he had seen a terrifying reflection of his own desperate need for connection. Pushing her away, reducing their encounter to a vulgar financial settlement, was an act of panicked self-preservation. He had to cauterize the wound she had opened, even if it meant becoming the unfeeling monster she had once believed him to be. He was alone again, as he had always been, but the silence was different, now heavier, haunted by the ghost of a warmth he had allowed himself to feel for a single ruinous night. When she finally walked through the door of her parents' house, the scent of lemon polish and stale regrets felt like a physical assault. Her mother was in the kitchen, her movements brisk and anxious, and she fired off a series of questions about where Clara had been, her words a barrage of thinly veiled disapproval. But it was the sight of her father that shattered Clara's fragile composure. He was in his usual armchair, staring out the window, a man lost in a fog of his own making. As she walked past him, he turned his head slightly, his vacant eyes meeting hers for a brief, agonizing moment. In their depths, she saw not an accusation, but a profound, bottomless sorrow that mirrored her own. She had betrayed him. She had slept with the enemy, the architect of this very ruin, and the guilt was a physical sickness that rose in her throat, threatening to choke her. In the solitude of her own small apartment, surrounded by the tools of her trade, Clara finally allowed herself to break. The sobs came in ragged, silent waves, a storm of grief for the girl she had been and the woman she had become overnight. The mission that had defined her existence for 5 years now seemed like a naive fantasy. She had approached Julian Croft's world with the arrogance of a righteous avenger, believing she could control the narrative, that she could wield her pain like a weapon. Instead, her pain had been a homing beacon, drawing her to his, and in their collision she had been the one to shatter. She looked at her reflection in the dark window and saw a stranger, a woman whose eyes held a new, dangerous knowledge. She had traded her armor for a wound, and she feared with a certainty that terrified her that this wound would never fully heal. Yet, as the days bled into a week of hollow routine, something else began to stir beneath the suffocating blanket of guilt and shame. It was a quiet, unfamiliar hum of power. The act that had broken her had also, in a strange way, freed her. For the first time, she had acted not out of duty, not for her father, not for revenge, but for a raw, selfish, undeniable want that was entirely her own. Her body, which she had always treated as a vessel for her obligations, now held the memory of pleasure, of being seen and desired. This nascent strength was terrifying. It whispered to her that her life did not have to be an endless penance for her father's loss. It suggested a future that was not defined by the ghosts of the past, but by the choices of the woman who was slowly, painfully emerging from the ruins of her old self. Julian, meanwhile, waged his own war by retreating into the familiar violence of the corporate world. He orchestrated a brutal, high-profile merger, a move the financial press described as a masterpiece of predatory capitalism. He was a whirlwind of cold fury, his meetings short, his decisions merciless, his staff walking on eggshells around the chilling aura of his renewed detachment. He was actively, consciously rebuilding the persona of the untouchable titan, brick by brutal brick. Each ruthless decision was a repudiation of the vulnerability he had shown Clara. He was trying to burn her memory out of his system with the all-consuming fire of his ambition, punishing himself by becoming an even more perfect, more isolated version of the man everyone already feared. He would prove to himself and to the world that he needed no one. The final, definitive blow arrived via courier a week later. It was a slim, elegant box containing her remaining tools, cleaned and polished, and a heavy cream envelope. Inside was not a personal note, but a formal letter from the Croft Collection's curator, thanking her for her services and stating that her contract was terminated, effective immediately. Tucked inside was the check he had started to write that morning. The amount was obscene, enough to solve all her family's financial problems and fund her own dreams for a decade. It was a golden cage, a final, contemptuous act of power designed to buy her silence and her submission. It was meant to be the end of the story, a neat and tidy conclusion where the billionaire paid off the girl and walked away unscathed. He was trying to purchase her absolution, to turn their shared scar into a simple line item on his expense report. Clara stared at the check, her hand, trembling not with weakness, but with a surge of cold, clarifying rage. This piece of paper was his final miscalculation. He thought he could erase her, could reduce the profound, terrifying thing that had happened between them to a mere financial settlement. He still saw her as the quiet, unassuming restorer, a problem to be managed and dismissed. He did not see the woman who had walked out of his penthouse, broken but not defeated. In that moment, holding the check in one hand and the weight of her family's past in the other, she understood that her path forward had nothing to do with him or her father. The choice was no longer about revenge or forgiveness. It was about reclaiming her own narrative. He had shown her his power, and now she would finally discover the true, unyielding nature of her own. She stood in the center of her small apartment, the check held between her thumb and forefinger. It was a heavy, substantial piece of paper, the ink a dark, arrogant slash against the cream background. It represented a world of power she had only ever glimpsed, a world that could erase problems, people, and memories with a simple signature. For a moment, she felt the seductive pull of it, the end of her family's struggles, the key to a life without the constant grinding pressure of debt. But then she looked at her own hands, stained with the honest pigments of her work, and she saw the truth. To accept this money would be to accept his narrative, that she was something to be. They bought, a complication to be settled. With a calm, deliberate motion, she tore the check in half and then in half again, the sound a soft, satisfying rip in the quiet room. It was not an act of anger, but of restoration, the meticulous removal of a foreign, corrupting layer to reveal the true value beneath. With the pieces of the check lying on her work table like fallen leaves, she turned her attention to the manila folder containing Julian's secrets. She spread the documents out. The cold, hard facts of the betrayal that had ruined two families, not just one. The names of the other partners, the hidden accounts, the truth of a conspiracy that had ensnared both her father and Julian in its web. The path to a brutal public revenge was laid out before her, a clear and devastating weapon, yet she felt no thirst for it. To unleash this story upon the world would be to start another fire, to create more wreckage. Her mission had never truly been about destruction. It had been about mending. With a quiet finality, she gathered the papers, slid them back into the folder, and placed it in a deep, locked drawer. She was not a judge, and she would no longer be an executioner. The war was over, because she was refusing to fight. The next morning, a small, unassuming package was delivered by courier to the top floor of the Croft Tower. Inside, Julian found no letter of blackmail, no legal threat, no desperate plea. He found only two things. First, the 4 neatly torn pieces of his check, placed together like a solved puzzle. And beneath them, resting on a bed of simple tissue paper, was a small, fragmented piece of 18th-century porcelain, a shard from a forgotten cup, perhaps, that had been painstakingly restored. The fine, golden lines of the kintsugi repair were visible, celebrating the break instead of hiding it. There was no note, no explanation needed. It was a message sent in her language, the language of mending what was broken. It was a rejection of his power, and an offering of a quiet, profound understanding that left him breathless in the sterile silence of his office. He had offered her a settlement, and she had sent back a masterpiece of forgiveness. He sank into his leather chair, the restored porcelain shard cool and delicate in the palm of his hand. He traced the golden seams with his thumb, feeling the slight, uneven texture where the pieces had been joined. The torn check was a declaration of her worth, a refusal to be quantified, and it had shaken him more than any corporate attack ever could. But this small mended object was a declaration of something far more devastating. Her grace. She had seen the very worst of him, the cynical, wounded core he kept hidden from the world, and she had not used it to destroy him. Instead, she had held it, acknowledged its fractures, and offered a glimpse of a world where broken things could be made beautiful again. For the first time in over a decade, the silence of his penthouse did not feel like a fortress. It felt like a cage, and he was utterly, devastatingly alone within it. Back in Queens, a different kind of light filled Clara's studio. It was the soft, forgiving light of late afternoon, and it illuminated not a damaged masterpiece on her easel, but a fresh, blank canvas. The scent of turpentine and linseed oil was no longer the smell of a duty she owed to the past, but the smell of possibility. She picked up a piece of charcoal, her fingers steady, and made the first mark. It was a tentative searching line, the beginning of a composition that was entirely her own. She did not know what it would become, and for the first time in her life, that uncertainty felt not like a fear, but like a freedom. She had walked into the dragon's lair, seeking justice for a story that had already been written, and had walked out with the one thing she never knew she was missing, a blank page on which to write her own. Their story concluded not with an embrace, but with a quiet, resonant space between two worlds. He in his tower of glass, holding a mended shard that had cracked his armor. She, in her small studio, creating a future from a blank canvas. They were two people forever marked by their collision, bound not by love but by the shared, silent understanding of their own intricate damages. The masterpiece she finally created was not revenge, but a quiet, fragile freedom, built from the ruins of who she used to be. If you believe that our deepest scars can become our greatest strengths and that true art is found in the courage to begin again, I invite you to subscribe, like, share, and comment on what this journey has meant to you.